In 1325, two Italian city-states went to war over a wooden bucket. Not a golden bucket, not a sacred bucket, not a bucket full of jewels or holy relics or state secrets. A plain, ordinary oakwood bucket that had been sitting in a public well in the middle of a town square. And when one city stole it, the other city raised an army of over 30,000 men to get it back. This is not a joke. This is one of the strangest and most humiliating wars in European history. And the bucket, it was never returned. To understand how a bucket started a war, you need to understand northern Italy in the early 1300s. The region was not one country. It was a fractured patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each one obsessed with pride, territory, and reputation. Two of the most bitter rivals sat just 30 kilometers apart, Bologna and Modena. Bologna was large, wealthy, and loyal to the Pope. Modena was smaller but fiercely aggressive and allied with the Holy Roman Emperor. These two factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, had been tearing Italy apart for over a century. Guelphs supported the papacy. Ghibellines backed the empire, and every city had to pick a side. Bologna and Modena had picked opposite ones. By the 1320s, the tension between the two cities was already unbearable. Border skirmishes were constant. Insults were public. Taxes were weaponized. And pride, raw, irrational, combustible pride, ran everything. Then came the bucket. In the autumn of 1325, a group of Modenese soldiers did something that no one expected. They slipped across the border, entered Bologna under the cover of night, and marched straight to the city's main civic well in the Piazza Maggiore, the beating heart of Bologna's public life. They grabbed a large oak bucket that sat at the well, the kind used to draw water for the entire neighborhood, and they carried it back to Modena. That was it, that was the provocation, a bucket. Now, to modern ears, this sounds absurd. But in a world where your city's honor was your personal honor, where a public insult could destroy a merchant's reputation or a politician's career, this was not small. The bucket sat in the civic center. It belonged to the people of Bologna. Stealing it was not theft, it was humiliation. It was Modena walking into the most public space in Bologna and saying, very loudly, that they could take whatever they wanted, and Bologna could not stop them. Bologna's response was immediate and furious. The city council demanded the bucket's return. Modena refused. Bologna threatened war. Modena laughed. So Bologna assembled the largest army it had ever raised. Contemporary accounts from the Bolognese chronicler Giovanni de Mussi and other Italian records describe the force Bologna put together. Over 30,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, mercenaries hired from across the region. Banners, drums, siege equipment, everything a medieval city could mobilize. This was not a raiding party. This was a full-scale invasion army, marching to retrieve a wooden bucket and, more importantly, to punish Modena for the insult. Modena, by comparison, had far fewer soldiers. Estimates vary, but most sources place their fighting force somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men. They were outnumbered roughly 4-1. On paper, this should have been a slaughter. Bologna had the numbers, the money, and the fury. Modena had less of everything. Almost everything. What Modena had was better leadership, better terrain knowledge, and a terrifying willingness to fight like they had nothing to lose. Because in many ways, they didn't. Their city was smaller. Their walls were weaker. If Bologna broke through, Modena would be occupied and humiliated. So when the two armies met on November 15, 1325, on a field near a small village called Zappolino, in the hills between the two cities, Modena's soldiers fought with the desperation of men defending everything they had. The Battle of Zappolino lasted roughly 2 hours, and in those 2 hours the impossible happened. Modena's smaller force shattered Bologna's enormous army. The Bolognese cavalry charged uphill and was broken by Modenese pikemen who held their ground on elevated terrain. The infantry advance collapsed into chaos as Modena's fighters exploited narrow roads and hedgerows to split the larger force into pieces that could not support each other. Mercenaries in Bologna's ranks, seeing the tide turn, began to flee, and once the mercenaries ran, the whole formation broke. Bologna's army did not just lose, it rooted. Soldiers threw down weapons and ran. Officers abandoned their horses. The great 30,000-man army that had marched out to retrieve a bucket stumbled home in humiliation, leaving hundreds of dead on the field near Zappolino. And Modena kept the bucket. This is the part that makes the whole story legendary. Even after the battle, even after the peace negotiations that followed, even after treaties were signed and borders were redrawn, Modena never gave the bucket back. Not in 1325, not in 1400, not ever. The original oak bucket was carried to Modena's civic tower, the Ghirlandina, a magnificent medieval bell tower that still stands in the heart of the city today. The bucket was placed in the tower's upper chamber behind locked doors, and there it remained. According to the Modena city records and the tower's historical inventory, the bucket is still there. You can visit it. You can see it. A 699-year-old oak bucket sitting in a tower in Modena, because in 1325 someone thought it would be funny to steal it from Bologna. And Bologna has never gotten it back. Now here is where the story takes an unexpected literary turn. Roughly 3 centuries later, an Italian poet named Alessandro Tassoni decided that this war was too ridiculous to forget. In 1614, he began writing a mock heroic poem called La Secchia Rapita, the stolen bucket, or in some translations, the rape of the bucket. Tassoni turned the entire conflict into a satirical epic, complete with gods intervening, heroes making absurd speeches, and the bucket itself becoming a symbol of everything petty and glorious about human conflict. The poem was published in 1622, and it became one of the most celebrated works of Italian satirical literature. Tassoni understood something that historians sometimes miss, that the most revealing wars are not the ones fought over empires or ideologies. They are the ones fought over nothing. Because when you fight over nothing, you reveal everything about how pride actually works. And that is what makes this story worth remembering. Because you have done this, maybe not with a bucket, but you have watched 2 people or 2 companies or 2 nations destroy something far more valuable than what they were fighting over. You have seen friendships end over a seat at a table. You have seen negotiations collapse because someone used the wrong word. You have seen people spend more energy defending their ego than it would have taken to solve the original problem 10 times over. The War of the Bucket is not about medieval Italy. It is about the human inability to let a small insult stay small. Bologna could have laughed. They could have sent a single messenger and made a joke about Modena's need for water. They could have ignored it entirely. Instead, they raised 30,000 men, marched them into the hills, lost a battle, lost hundreds of lives, lost territory, and still, did not get the bucket back. And Modena won the battle. They won the war. They kept the bucket. But they also revealed something uncomfortable about victory, that sometimes you win not because you were right, but because the other side was too proud to be wise. 699 years later, the oak bucket still sits in the Ghirlandina Tower in Modena. It is old. It is cracked. It is worthless in any material sense. And it is one of the most powerful reminders in European history that the things we fight hardest over are almost never the things that matter most. Sometimes the greatest war trophy is the one nobody should have wanted in the first place.